2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe Libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.
All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Hello and welcome to the Actual Anarchy podcast, the podcast where we talk about movies from a Rothbardian Anarcho-Capitalist perspective. Tonight we're going to talk about another movie series. This one is going to be centered on The Starving Games. Well, actually, that's a comedic spoof on The Hunger Games, which was a book series and a film series that was pretty popular and made Jennifer Lawrence a bit of a A-list star, if you will. And so this will be episode 87, and I spoiled the joke the other day by saying we were so 86 that we're 87, and that is the episode number. actualanarchy.com/87 for show notes and more. How are you doing, Robert?
Oh, doing great, guys. Just doing great. It's me and the dogs out here to record another episode. Feeling good. Feeling hot. I got all kinds of juice stuff for this episode. More juice than I have content. So we'll see how this one goes.
All right. Yeah, this might be a short one. Now, before we got started, I was telling you in our pre-show content that I finally figured out how to get the air conditioner installed into my office. And I got to tell you, it's MacGyver meets Brojex without the duct tape. But I got it to work.
Who the hell is Brojex?
Brojex is this really cheesy Canadian home improvement show where they go to these old cabins that were built like 40 or 50 years ago that are all falling apart, and the guys go in and juice them up, make them super nice, and they do it in a weekend. And oh wait, no, that's not it. That's a different show. Yeah, it's another weird, cheesy Canadian show. It's two like redneck brothers in Canada who come up with crazy ideas and then build things out of junk. Like they made like a floating performance stage for their band that had like a double-decker top, and they could have the drum kit on the top of this, on the roof of this float, and then a microphone and guitar and everything, and then another pontoon set up where they could roast marshmallows in a fire pit on the water. Anyway, it's called Brojex, and so my wife and I, whenever we do like really half-assed projects around the house, just using scraps, we call it projecting. So that's what I did to get the air conditioner installed in my office.
Well, I'm fully in favor of any kind of juicing that goes on. So if you juiced up your studio with some sort of redneck project enhancement of air conditioning, I'm all in favor, sir.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate that. This thing does get hot, like super hot. And the prior solution was a one of those portable units that sits on the floor and has an exhaust fan or exhaust tube that goes out like a hole in the wall or a window. And that thing just couldn't keep up with the fluctuations that this office is subjected to. But this other unit, pristine, just clean, Bob, worth every penny.
Your office has a glory hole? Is that what you're saying? I wasn't quite following what you were saying.
It does now. It does now for two hoses, one intake and one output.
Oh, deluxe.
It goes both ways. Speaking of going both ways, why don't we get into the Last Nighters portion of the show?
Is that where we go both ways?
It's the normie-friendly missionary style. Sure. Yeah, why not?
Do missionaries go both ways?
Let's not go there, but let's get into the Last Nighters. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Hey everyone, it's Daniel and Robert, the Last Nighters. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We're going to be talking about The Hunger Games. This is episode 30, and you can find the show notes and more at lastnighters.com/30. You can also find The Last Nighters on the launchpadmedia.com, and the is important for that URL. And the Launchpad Media has exclusive content on news, movies, culture, a bunch of other good stuff where they're always throwing new ideas in your direction. So do check that out. We're also part of the Libertarian Union, which you may have just heard our little show plug about that. So do check that out. There's another dozen or so show providers listed on there. And the site just went through a revamp. So it's looking all super nice and groovy. And let's say hello to my co-host, Robert, before we get into the Google Descripciones.
Hey, everybody out there in the internet world. Back again, doing it again. Do, why, keep doing it. Yep, on the websites. talking about movies on the shows with my buddy. Yeah, doing great, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. And why don't we just get into this thing, because that's what we're here for. And if you guys heard our last episode on Mission Impossible, we know it was a little bit disjointed. We're going to try harder this time, and hopefully you enjoy it. So here we go.
Even more disjointed.
Even more. But wait, there's more. The Google Description, The Hunger Games, fantasy science fiction film, 2 hours and 22 minutes. In what was once North America, the capital of Panem maintains its hold on its 12 districts by forcing them each to select a boy and a girl, called tributes, to compete in a nationally televised event called The Hunger Games. Every citizen must watch as the youths fight to the death until only one remains. District 12, Tribute Katniss Everdeen, has little to rely on other than her hunting skills and sharp instincts in an arena where she must weigh survival against love. And that is the description for the first film. What do you think, Robert?
You know, Panem, not very progressive for a very, I don't know, it seems like a very radical culture. But they choose one boy and one girl. What about the other 70 genders? They just get off scot-free. I'd be like, sorry, bro, can't participate. I don't identify as either a boy or a girl.
Well, there you go, man. That's how you get out of it.
That's what you should do. It's what everybody should do. No, that sounds about right. For the whole series, it's the story of a revolution, of a brutal regime oppressing a whole bunch of people in the wake of a civil war. And it's the story of Katniss leading this revolt, sort of leading. She's like a reluctant leader, and starts off as a tribute, one of these kids that has to murder other kids to survive, and then eventually becomes like the face of the resistance, only to be used and abused by both sides throughout the series. And in the end, what really changes? I don't know. I think it's Stephanie. Is it Stephanie Meyer who wrote these books? It seems like a fairly nuanced and like woke assessment of revolutions.
Yeah, the author is Suzanne Collins. That's the name.
You there?
I am, yes. The author is Suzanne Collins.
Okay. Am I coming through okay? Or am I like digitizing out?
No, you're great. Groovy. Grand.
Okay, good.
Great, wonderful.
You're digitizing out on my end, but that's okay.
All right, I think it's picking up what I'm putting down, so I think we're okay. All right, so yeah, the book series by Suzanne Collins, and it became 4 films. We're primarily just going to talk in generalities about this thing, but I do find it rather interesting that you had a revolution in the United States, well, prior to becoming the United States, based on essentially what was a 3% tax, right? And now, in present day, it's like almost over 40% if you count not only federal, but your state and your local and property taxes and permits and licenses and fees and all those things. And you've got a bunch of socialists out there clamoring for more, demanding more. They want free healthcare, free college, free everything. And it's really interesting to me that we had a revolution based on much smaller than that. And then it seems like in the Hunger Games, we're looking towards the future a bit more. And they're not even revolting when their kids are being taken from them and put into this murder arena, gladiatorial style combat.
Right. No, it's very much like an Overton window pushing, boiling frog situation where this could very well be our future. Could very well be a situation where people are just like, yeah, well, they only take the firstborn, so it's okay. We still got 2 other kids. It'll be fine, And then we would get upset if, they change the rules on us and all of a sudden it's the first and the second child or something like that. And you're like, wait a minute, that's not right.
Right. I mean,
because that's not what you said the first time, as opposed to, objecting to it on moral grounds.
Right. And you could almost argue that many of the components of this already exist. Like when there was a draft, and now it's slightly different. Now there's a selective service, so you're sort of compelled to, quote unquote, volunteer to be eligible to be drafted. But they're taking essentially kids, right, 18, 19, and sending them off to the other side of the world to go and be shot at and shoot at other people. So it's not even like, in a way, it seems worse than just the traditional ideas of slavery. And I know this might be controversial, but the difference here is that not only are you being forced against your will to go do something, but you're being forced against your will to go and kill people. Not just like work on some land. So to me, that seemed like a step up. Now, the length of the compulsion might be shorter in a draft type scenario, but in this movie series, I mean, it's like they fight to the death, right? There's one survivor out of the 24 tributes that get into this entire game every year, right?
Yeah, that is correct. It's funny how the draft and modern day nation states, which is essentially the only religion that still requires human sacrifice, gets a pass. Slavery, we point out that that's abhorrent, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that's the worst thing ever, and blah blah blah. But modern day slavery, people don't even bat an eyeball to it. I mean, there is still modern day like sex slavery, and people will traffic in people and kids and whatnot and sell them into slavery. It happens all the time. And then people rightly look upon that as being horrific and immoral. But yet it's still all part of this nebulous, social contract that just because you're born in some area, the group of thugs that go around extorting people have a right to force you to go kill and be killed because you're of a certain gender, or, well, just because you live in a certain area, because you're a certain age. For some reason, as long as it's declared by a group of people that were voted upon or whatever, then all of a sudden it's legitimate.
Well, and it's rarely declared to begin with. But even beyond that, they're clamoring for the gender equality in being eligible to be drafted. So now they want to have women be able to be in the selective service, like that's some kind of a benefit,
Well, yeah, and remember the fear over the transgenders not being allowed to be in the military because that was discriminatory. When in fact, and I loved it. Even the responses by the military folks were the best in my mind to that, because they were like, yeah, the military discriminates on all kinds of shit. They discriminate on age, weight, eyesight, any kind of disabilities, your physical, fitness level. If you got, a limp, if you got astigmatism, all kinds of different reasons and things that they discriminate on. But, people got really upset when, for some reason, the transgender people wanted to go kill and be killed people.
Right. And wasn't the whole premise of one of the characters in MASH, what was it, Corporal Klinger? Is that the guy's name? Where he would cross-dress in an effort to be kicked out?
Yeah, he was trying to get the dishonorable discharge, or what was, I don't know if it was an honorable dishonorable, but yeah, he wanted to be declared basically insane. So he would wear women's clothes openly on duty,
Yeah, so it's a little bit ironic that it comes full circle. And part of me wonders if that is, I have this theory that culture, media, movies, television, etc., is where they sort of float ideas to make them more acceptable to the public in general, and then a few years later, after that's been sort of got a toehold, then it becomes a political movement. So you see things like, MASH was in the 70s, and then you've got, not that it's really transgender, but you get, the common example is like Will and Grace and other things that make homosexual and homosexual rights be an issue, right? It starts building momentum. It gets into the consciousness of the average boobus Americanus, like the voters.
Yeah, so how can we turn this to our favor, Daniel? We need to get ideas of liberty, freedom, ending the drug war, just all drugs legalized, get all that into the mainstream consciousness. And then in 10, 15, 20 years, when the kids who grew up with it come of age, and they're like, well, yeah, duh, that's how things should be.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why The Wire was such a good series, and then Firefly, almost through no fault of the creator, was rather libertarian. But yeah, it would be great to see more of that kind of a thing. And I'll argue that The Hunger Games, in a way, has some libertarian themes in it, which we can get into here. But one last...
Oh, really? Do tell, Daniel.
Well, one last point about this idea of the draft and conscription and taking these tributes and sending them off to go and kill each other. It's sort of a keystone to the whole idea of, if the state can get away with this, then everything else almost pales in comparison, right? Like, if they can tell you have to serve them for a couple of years, go off and try to kill other tributes, then anything else that's even lesser than that is almost a given that they can do it, right? So this becomes an ability for the state to have an ever-increasing amount of power, near limitless power. And this is a point that a guy named Robert Higgs makes in a lecture that I'll post in the show notes below. He's got a chapter, I think, in Against Leviathan about it. But he basically argues that if they can get away with this and make this palatable and acceptable to the masses, then they can get away with anything else that they desire.
Especially in a world where information, accurate information about war is readily available. I was listening to an interesting podcast, Hardcore History, Dan Carlin, recently. It was about Teddy Roosevelt and the Philippine War and the war with Spain around the turn of the century, the 1900s. And this is a time when Americans, and especially young boys, were so gung-ho that they were doing whatever they could to get accepted into the war. Like, they thought that, if they didn't get to fight, it was just going to be the worst thing in the world. And they were worried about the war being over before they saw combat. They were worried that, they wouldn't be accepted, so they'd put rocks in their pants so that they'd weigh enough. But, what else did they hear in the media? In the media at the time, you're not exactly getting on the spot, video evidence of all the horrors of war. You got fluff pieces written essentially by the Pentagon. Well, not the Pentagon at the time, but basically by the government and other pro-war type people that are glossing over any kind of atrocities and really talking it up how wonderful war is. And so then you got these kids that are just eating this crap up. You're being told that this is how you become a man. This is what men do. And that, it takes advantage of that instinct of men to protect, their families, and they project it out and they pervert it and they twist it and they use it to commit horrific atrocities. But it's harder to do that in an age where you can just look up on the internet, what war is like, or all these movies that are fairly realistic. I mean, not entirely, but fairly realistic. But there's all kinds of media and people talking about war and the horrificness of it. And yet people are still perfectly fine with it. I mean, where are all the anti-war rallies these days? They don't exist. Where are the protests? Where's the outrage over the war? It seems like it's just been this dull drumbeat in the back of people's minds that you just kind of tune out because it's ever present, and you can't get outraged every day about the same old thing.
Well, fortunately for them, there's a new outrage of the week, at least it seems, with anything that Trump has either said or tweeted or didn't bow and scrape to, the Queen, or he sat with Putin and said nice things. It's like every week there's some new outrage to be upset about, but it's always something rather stupid and ridiculous, whereas there are horrible atrocities happening all over the world that tend to get ignored, and those are all related to, the warfare state. And then we've got the highest prison population in the world. We've got a guy like Ross Ulbricht in prison for life for providing a marketplace for people. There's plenty of things that ought outrage people, but they get glossed over and people get outraged over stupid stuff. Yeah,
it seems to be much easier to get outraged over words, or I don't even know what. It seems to be just words.
Yeah.
Than it is to actually get outraged over actions.
But back to your point about, televising war or showing what war is, I think that was a lot of why the Vietnam War was so unpopular, was because there was a fair amount of reporting going on and embedded reporters and photographers in film coming back, showing how horrible it was and the atrocities and the violence. And then it sort of got sanitized, I think, during the first Gulf War in the 1990s, where it almost looked like a video game, You had the smart, quote-unquote, smart bombs that would still miss their target and blow up hospitals. But it looked like, green screen type Pong-style graphics, because it was like the night bombing raid of Baghdad. Do you remember that at all? I know we were pretty young when that happened. But
I remember exactly. Yeah, I remember watching that. That was the movie that played on CNN for about a month, and then it was over.
Right.
And, Carlin makes this point also in that podcast I was talking about, because the war with the Spanish essentially over Cuba, or the whole Remember the Maine and all that business, was super short, and the United States just obliterated them. I mean, the Spanish Armada was not what it once was, and the modern U.S. Navy just obliterated them. I mean, talking like battles where one U.S. soldier would die because he stumbled and fell, but everybody, then you're sinking every Spanish ship, and just hundreds of thousands of them are dying. Then you go to a war like the Philippines, and it's a big slog, and you're butchering entire villages, and then you're getting butchered because it's a guerrilla war. It's a totally different type of engagement, and then that's unpopular. Just like in Vietnam, which was a slog, which was just this, you're fighting a guerrilla war. It's an occupational war, just like the Philippines was. You're fighting somebody on their land. You're invading their land, and they're faced with a superior force. So what do? Sun Tzu says you harry them, you harass them, you destroy their supply lines, you fight a guerrilla war. That's what they did. And those kind of wars are very unpopular. But the fact that even short, sweet, winning wars are popular is really kind of disgusting from my standpoint. I mean, I can't imagine that anybody really thought that the nation of Iraq had to be destroyed in the first Gulf War, but it did, and it happened in about 30 days.
Yeah, and yet still left the supposed evil dictator in power for another 15 years or so.
Yeah.
But anyway, this sort of ties back to the movie a little bit, because how they're televising the tributes trying to kill each other. We see this in drafted and even some volunteer military things happening around the world, and seeing that get reported. And that fills your nightly news. So there are a lot of parallels, I think.
Indeed there are, sir. What did you think about this series as a whole in terms of the way it starts and the way it ends, especially? Do you think that the author intended it to be a commentary on the nature of cyclical revolutions?
I don't know. I sort of took this at more of a face value thing. Like, this is what I read after I read Harry Potter. So this was before I got into like Austrian economics and history and other things like that. I would read this kind of pop culture, youth, teen beat type stories.
Tiger Beat.
And I found
Sweet.
that this was very similar to the Harry Potter series, in that it was meant for keeping you entertained, keeping the story going, becoming a property, becoming a franchise, becoming a film series. And so it had to mix in a bunch of action. And it's like they took all these components and needed to craft them into something that the masses desired. So again, glad to
So you're not giving the author credit for having like a message that she thought was important.
Well, maybe she did. It's perhaps lost on me. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I thought it was really good. I thought that was the best part of the whole series, is the fact that the rebels take over and then they immediately want to punish those that were in power before, all the brutal people, as would be just, I think. All these people that brutally murdered all these people, you probably want to punish them somehow, whether through ostracization or whatever you decide. But then the rebels immediately start clamping down, and then they commit atrocities, and then they sow resentment and anger, and then they just wanted power in the first place, and then the cycle continues. And it's really just two groups disagreeing on how to rule people. It's like, no, you're doing it wrong. You're killing too many people. You need to rule so that you don't have to kill too many people. And then they get in power, and they're like, oh, wait a minute. Look at all these people that need to get killed. We need to kill these people. And then the people who are friends with or love the people that got killed are like, I don't like these people. We need to revolt. And it's just over and over and over again. And it's like nobody ever recognizes why the ring of power shouldn't be held by anybody.
That's a powerful message, Robert. And since I haven't watched the movie series in a little while here, I think it's sort of lost on me when you're talking about the rebels taking over. Isn't that what happened like at the very end? And then they're going to execute Snow, and then Katniss doesn't kill him and ends up killing the new leader, who was from District 13, who everyone had told the how do I say this? The propaganda was that District 13 didn't exist any longer.
Yeah, that's what happens. She ends up killing the leader of 13, recognizing that she was just going to be another tyrant like Snow. And eventually she, just taps out. I can't deal with this anymore. And, fair enough. But I still found that message to come through, because she recognized that the District 13 lady was just disagreeing with Snow on how to rule people, or she wanted to be in power as opposed to having Snow in power. It's just different groups of people saying, no, I'm going to exert my will and authority over other people. No, I'm going to do it. No, I'm going to do it. It's just in this endless cycle.
Yeah, with
and
slightly different
how long is this
flavor.
going to go on before humans recognize that there shouldn't be anybody in the chair?
Yeah, hopefully that day is coming. Hopefully the new Gutenberg press, of which we are a part, the internet, podcasting, and other things like that, getting the message out. Self-organization is
There's
very
a conversation
powerful.
between it in the second movie, the very beginning of the second movie, between Katniss and Snow, and they talk about how the giving of the they're going to eat the berries at the end of the first movie because they didn't want to live without each other. They were so in love with each other. And so then, the game says, well, there has to be a winner. So, okay, both of these people win. And then at the beginning of the second movie, Snow goes to talk to Katniss. And he's like, that act of the berries could have been seen as an act of defiance. And that single act of defiance could bring this whole system crashing down. And Katniss is like, well, why is it so fragile that one single act of defiance could bring it crashing down? And how does Snow not recognize that, why that is? Because of the horrific, brutal repression of the people, forcing children to fight in gladiatorial games, robbing people of their wealth so that the capital thrives in this ridiculous opulence. I mean, White should know, the character isn't stupid, right? He should know that it's their own actions, which breeds nothing but resentment, which would make a single act of resistance bring on a war. You know what I'm talking about, Daniel? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I feel like this is one of those things that when it's you, the perspective is difficult to see, whereas if it was somebody else viewing it from a different angle, they could see the situation. It's sort of like when a friend comes to you for advice, like relationship advice. Like they're so involved they don't see the problem, but some neutral observer can easily pinpoint it. So maybe that's what he's running into, because he has that power and he wants to maintain it. And the only tool that he really has at his disposal is violence, right? He's trying to keep people in line and in fear. He's using fear as the motivator.
Right. I suppose in order to maintain your legitimacy, quote unquote, you have to enforce the laws that you decree. You can't just have like suggestions. But it sure seems like, I understand that the opulence of the capital is only maintained by the constant shipments from all the different districts. And I assume any kind of austerity wouldn't be very popular in the capital. And maybe then he would have his own people tearing him, destroying him. I don't know. But it seems like the situation he's in is untenable. So the best solution would have been to stop stealing from the districts so much. Stop killing their kids so much. Stop brutally assaulting them so much. They send in like these peacekeeper forces who are just like these god figures, and they just assault anybody they want and kill and murder anybody they want. And if you dare fight back, they just murder you. You think you might resent those people at all? Yeah, maybe just a little bit.
Yeah, it's
there's a term in the military, I forget what it's called, but we've talked about it in the past, where you destroy like a village, or you destroy like a hut, you burn a hut down, and for every guy you kill, you create 10 more enemies. And that's what happens when you treat people poorly. When you treat people horrifically and you mistreat them and you beat them and you attack them and you kill their friends, all you do is you breed resentment and you create enemies. By its very definition, that's what you do. How can people in these positions of power not understand that? It seems really, really academic to me.
Yeah, and that was, I believe, the Stanley McChrystal concept, where if you kill one, you end up making 10 new belligerents. And so he wanted to implement his coin strategy, counterintelligence, something or other. I forget exactly.
Yeah, that was the Afghanistan war guy, but that goes back farther than that. That goes back at least to the Vietnam War when they were doing this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's the same principle. Yeah,
you'd think that they would recognize that, hey, we're upsetting a lot of people here, and eventually they're going to resist in a more effective way, right? You can only push some people so far. And like how we opened this show, the tax question and the amount of influence the government had in people's lives back in 1776, they had a much lower boiling point at the time than they seem to now, and especially in this film series.
But even the founding fathers of 1776, even they weren't, they were upset about taxation without representation. They were even okay with taxation. They're like, yeah, okay, steal from us, but we want some sort of home rule. Like, we want people that look like us to be ruling over us. Don't get me wrong, it was a step in the right direction, but, it's not like these people were anarchists or anything.
Right, yeah. They wanted their rulers to be more similar and closer.
Right.
Yeah, and then to the point that you made earlier, I just wanted to mention that, any government law that has any significance or relevance is only there preventing people from doing what they would have otherwise voluntarily chosen, right? Otherwise, the law is pointless. Like, if it's something people are going to do, you don't need a law telling them that's what they need to do. So at best, they're irrelevant, and at worst, well, there's a body count of over 400 million people in the 20th century alone as a result of democide or war. So that's a pretty significant unbalanced equation there. If you if you follow what I'm saying here.
I think I know what you're talking about, Daniel. I think you're trying to say that statism is bad. It's bad.
It's kind of bad, MK.
I tend to agree with you.
All right, let's talk a little bit about District 13 because, in a way, they sort of went galt. And didn't they have a nuke? And wasn't that what was one of the things preventing the capital from attacking them? And so the capital's response was to almost wipe them from memory, wipe them from existence, sort of deny that they still existed at all, or just say that they had been blown up?
Yeah, there was propaganda out that the District 13 no longer existed, that there was a war, and yeah, they totally annihilated them. But yeah, in your reality, I believe if they didn't have a nuke, and they might have, and that's an interesting point, if they did have a nuke, and I can't quite specifically remember whether they did or not, but let's just say they did. In modern world, a nuclear weapon is a deterrent against attack, right? I mean, nobody wants to start a nuclear war because, politicians could actually die in a nuclear war. So, I mean, there's a reason why, no nuclear-armed country has gone to war with another nuclear-armed country since nukes have been around.
Yeah, other than by proxy or extension, sort of an arm's length deal where it was through a third party.
Right, yeah,
country.
like we've sort of been at war with China and sort of been at war with Russia, like on this, a little muddy, country that neither of them are actually supposed to be in or support. But yeah, it's kind of an incentive for everybody to get nukes, isn't it? You want a weapon that you can actually hit the people that would be wanting to kill you. And we're talking about, the politicians, like the people of the countries. They don't care. They're just trying to live their lives. And yeah, some of them might fall for the propaganda of, these people in X country are all evil or whatever. And some of them might even sign up to go fight in some war that goes kill those people because, propaganda is a powerful tool. Cognitive dissonance is a powerful tool. Pride, all these things are really sense of, protection. All these things are really powerful, exploitable, characteristics of human beings.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting that you mentioned the propaganda because there certainly was plenty of it in this film, and they use it actually as a tool to fight back against the Capitol, where they actually have Katniss starring in these motivational little bits where they pretend like she's fighting in battle and doing something amazing to sort of rally the masses to keep their spirits up. And these are like
she absolutely
fake
serves
situations.
as like this figurehead, as the Mockingjay figurehead, and kind of like the Captain America character in Marvel Comics, or I'm sure there have been others, but that's the one that springs to mind, of just like this pure propaganda character that is worth far more to you as inspiration than anything else.
Right, yeah, because they were also reluctant to actually put her into actual battle because she was worth more to them as, like you said, this lightning rod or this inspirational figure. So they put her into fake battle situations and tried to build her up and make her look like she's done something amazing when really she hadn't done a whole lot. And in many ways, she was a bit like Harry Potter, where Harry Potter just really doesn't do anything either. Sort of lucks into some things. There is one scene where she does demonstrate like half-decent bow staff skills. Archery skills. You remember in the training center where she's trying to get their attention and prove to them that she's like got some level of skill, and she shoots an arrow through an apple, I think near Snow, or Snow's holding it or something like that. And that's really about the extent of her abilities actually being put on display in pretty much this entire movie series.
Well, I think it's interesting that how often, or how the fact that they did use Katniss as an information weapon, because information, like an information war, is almost as important as like the real war. If you're fighting a war, like Goebbels understood this massively, the value of propaganda to keep morale up at home and with the troops and to demoralize your enemy is so critical to actually winning if you want to win. I mean, back in the day, back when, when people fought like hand to hand, like with knights and swordsmen and axes and clubs, it's something like, I forget what the actual number is, but it's a ridiculously high number. It's almost like 90% of casualties happen when one of the sides that are fighting, you're fighting like shoulder to shoulder against other men shoulder to shoulder. And you got guys behind you that are going to take over for you when you get too tired, because you're basically just trying to stab and hack and chop. And, like 10% of casualties happen when you're actually facing the enemy. And the other 90% happen when one side breaks morale and just starts running away. And they're like, we're going to lose, we're going to die. And that's when like the cavalry come in and start putting spears through people's backs as they're running away.
Yeah, that seems like
so just the value of morale is huge.
Unsportsmanlike conduct there.
Yeah, there was a referee on the battlefield who would give the yellow card.
Yeah,
It's true.
That is surprising, and I wonder if that's one of the reasons why. I mean, you see it in the movies all the time, where they say hold your formation. Don't break the line. You see it in Braveheart, and you see it in like pretty much any old style military movie like this. I wonder if that's because of this phenomena.
Well, yeah, I mean, you didn't want people breaking through your lines, to get to people, being able to stab them in the back or to get to your supplies or any other number of bad things that could happen. But also, yeah, when somebody broke through, it was a huge morale killer, because then, what do? You either try and beat the people back to reform the line, or you form up into, like a new line, two new lines, like the two different separated forces. And that's what people were always trying to do back then. You're trying to divide and conquer. You're trying to divide the two forces, and then you'd surround them, and then you'd slowly just crunch them.
That sounds like politics.
Yeah, it's pretty much like politics. I mean, the culture in today, in the United States is so divided, where half the country calling the other country, half the country like Nazis. It's, kind of divided.
Yeah, the irony of that, of course, is that the ones usually calling people Nazis are the ones who advocate for Nazi tactics, right? Silencing speech, having state control of industry,
Well, yeah, they're the actual socialists.
Right, yeah. And it's bizarre that they don't recognize that the things that they're wanting are the things that the Nazis wanted. Like, they literally want almost exactly the platform that Hitler had, minus the race component. Well, actually, I'll take that back. They actually want the race component in there, but just in the other direction.
Yeah, man, it's really a weird time to be alive. It is. First of all, it's just incredibly lazy. There was I don't know if you've seen these videos, but there's down in Australia, like Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern gave a talk where the police actually charged them $68,000 to keep the peace. It's kind of strange that you would have an event and people would attack it, and the cops come and then they blame the victims. Like, here you got attacked by terrorists. That'll be $68,000. But anyway, the protesters were just calling everybody a Nazi. Everybody on the other side, anybody that even wanted to go in and just listen to the talk. They didn't know these people. You don't know what they're going for, what the reason of what they're going for, if they agree with everything the person says, or if these are actual Nazis, or even if Stefan Molyneux is a Nazi, which to call an anarchist, to call like this libertarian philosopher, anarcho-capitalist dude, a Nazi. He's about as far away from a Nazi as it gets, but it just goes to show you that people don't understand what was wrong about the Nazis. Larkin Rose did a great video on YouTube. I think I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it's something like, what did the Nazis do wrong? Something like that. And it's like you said, they advocate for almost all the things that Hitler does, or Hitler did. But what the Nazis did wrong was that, they had this belief in authority, and if somebody ordered you to do this immoral thing, they went and did it. Just like soldiers do today. And that's kind of Larkin's point. It's not, these things always go bad, is his point. It's always, when you believe in authority and you believe that someone can tell you to do a thing that it goes against your conscience, it's not going to end well. And there's going to be this continual human meat grinder where it seems like we're never going to learn this lesson, and it's really frustrating. And I'm trying to think of a way to bring this back to the movie, but I can't. Other than the fact that the revolution of Pan Am is just this endless meat grinder.
Yeah. Now the anti-Trump people, are they borrowing the resistance from this movie series, or is it more from the SJW wars? Star Wars.
The anti-Trump people are thinking that they are like the rebels. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, the resistance, because it literally is called the resistance now in the new series, correct? In the new trilogy.
Yes. They call themselves the Resistance for some reason, even though it doesn't make any sense, because they totally destroyed the Empire at the end of Return of the Jedi. And then what happened that now they're on the run again from this new Empire people?
Slowly, very slowly on the run.
Yes, mercurially running away from the Empire.
All right. Well, I want to ask you about the, you talked about the tactics of war, and most of the injuries happen when people are trying to escape and their morale is broken, and they're getting shot or stabbed in the back. Now,
yes,
in gentlemanly combat, shooting someone in the back would not be, the normal standard of combat, right? That would be a faux pas, if you will. So like,
I would agree with that.
like a war crime.
It's a dick move.
Yeah, it's a dick move. So it's a bit of a war crime. What do you think about at the end of the fourth movie where these aid packets are parachuted down into a crowd and it's marked as medical supplies and they're bombs? And that was like a last-ditch effort where it was a false flag, right? People were supposed to think that it was Snow doing this because he was on the run, right? They were closing in on him. But it was revealed that it was actually the attacking force, right? It was the District 13 commander trying to make Snow appear like ultimately evil, very Hitler-like with this move.
Right. Yeah, it's more information war. And I think that Katniss recognized it, right? I forget when she figured it out, but one of those bombs exploded and killed her sister. And maybe that was what did it, that turned her over. I don't know. But yeah, this is a common tactic in modern warfare, and it's pretty much as old as humans, where you're constantly trying to demonize your enemy and make them out to be the other or just a horrific villain. And it makes them a lot easier to kill. Because if you recognize that that person over there is a human being with wants and desires and loves and, has people that love them, and it's a whole lot different. It's more difficult. That's why they put helmets on the bad guys in movies and TVs, because you don't actually want to be able to see their eyeballs and that they have faces and they're people when they're getting slaughtered en masse by the heroes. It makes it a lot easier to just have them be faceless goons or just, quote, bad guys. Right. It's the psychology of war, man.
And so doing this dick move by exploding the medical supplies on these people is a false flag to make Snow appear to be the ultimate evil. But, tying it back to your comment about the Maine, wasn't the Maine also a false flag? Like, weren't there multiple false flag events? The Gulf of Tonkin, Pearl Harbor had some foreshadowing, some forewarning. It was sort of like known by higher ups that was impending, and they knew where and roughly when that attack was going to happen, and they still allowed it.
Sure, the Reichstag. Mm-hmm.
And so they're willing to kill their own people, many of them, in order to gin up the rest of them to support more bloodshed.
Yeah, and it's usually to make money, usually. I mean, these people, like we've said in the past, politicians are there for 4 to 8 years, generally speaking. I mean, some keep winning elections and come back for life, like Strom Thurmond or whoever. But they're basically there to get in, pillage, and get out. And, the best way to do that is to make a bunch of money for your buddies in, private industry. And usually, that's the war profiteers, the defense contractors that make a ton of cash, and they need to have a war to fight. So, when you don't have an enemy, you make one. And if you don't have a war, you gin one up. You get everybody outraged. You blow up some kids. I mean, we mentioned this in the past, the Operation Northwoods, which got vetoed by Kennedy, but went up to McNamara, where the plan. This has all been declassified, and this is just one of their plans. This is just the one that's gotten declassified. Who knows how many of these they've actually carried out? But the plan was to blow up buses full of kids and to blow up airplanes and blame it on Castro and to start a war. This is what these people do. And they want something. This is something they want. And these people are very Machiavellian about it. They'll just, the ends justify the means. Hey, if we got to kill a couple of kids to get what we want, to maybe fight, the evil Russian menace or whatever it is that they wanted, to get the missiles out of Cuba or whatever justification it is, or to stop the flow of communism into Vietnam, to stop the dominoes from crashing all throughout Southeast Asia, we're going to go and murder and slaughter all these people. Because that's always a good idea, and it doesn't create any resentment. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel. Bunch of propaganda where you say that killing people and their friends and blowing up weddings and butchering old people and women and children and smashing babies' heads against the wall, gets anybody upset, because it doesn't. So and this is the nature of authority. It's just, this seems to be the inevitable outcome, the natural result. And people blame this on capitalism, when this is not capitalistic at all. But anytime anybody's making money, they call it capitalism, which just isn't true. Capitalism is about private property and voluntary interactions, not about murdering people, because that's a violation of private property. See how that works? But it seems to be inevitable when you believe in this political authority, that political authority is going to turn corrupt and work against, it's going to work for their own interests. It's not for your interests. It's not for my interests. They say it is. They claim it is. That's just the line that they tell the rubes what they're really doing is there to get theirs. I mean, there's a reason why Washington, D.C. is one of the most rich districts in the world, and people go in, a millionaire, and they leave like a multi-millionaire. I mean, it's a racket, and I'm sure you got points to make. I could talk more, but we could. Am I still on the call? Are we still recording? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I feel like I've been ranting for a while.
We're still going. This is good rant. I don't know if it's really that tied to our movie or our movie series that we're talking about, but if people have seen The Hunger Games, you kind of maybe have an idea of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's the job of the audience now to tie into what we said to The Hunger Games. Sure. There you go. Loosely tied. Hey, is it inspiring this? Then it's fine.
Yeah,
Daniel, go ahead.
Well, part of me feels like we're acting like Haymitch, the Woody Harrelson character, who's famous for being a winner in the games, and nowadays he's pretty much a useless drunk. I kind of feel like we're approaching the show that way, even though I'm not drunk, and I don't think you are either.
I could be, but I'm not.
We should be. We ought be. There'd at least be a reason for why we're doing so great on this episode.
That's right.
Anyway, you were about to say something else.
Was I? Oh, okay. So you read the books. So this struck me as a kind of a young adult romance novel that got turned into, there was like actually a pretty good young adult romance novel. And, it was like, oh, this is actually pretty good. Maybe I should release it and be good. So I remember at the time when I was reading this, there was some debate, I think, between me and my sister, who was also reading it at the time, as to who Katniss should end up with. And I don't remember what I said. I'm going to ask you if you gave a shit while you were reading these.
Well, she had a hard-on for Gale, who was the strapping, good-looking guy, right? And he was kind of into her.
Yeah, but Gale kind of got the short shrift in the movies. I thought that in the books he got a more screen time, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, they had that interaction in the early part where they went out hunting together and they would do that. And then he went off to fight, but then they kept kind of running into each other here and there. And Peeta, who she did end up with, they had the moment within the games themselves and did the eat the berries thing to the Romeo and Juliet style thing. But they were using that as propaganda to make them not killable, right? If the population, if the viewing audience bought into it, that's all they needed to both be able to survive. So they were using that. But then they turned Peeta against her and gave him, the Clockwork Orange Welcome to the Jungle style, psychological trauma to make him hate her. Like they would inflict pain and associate with her. And then he wanted to kill her the moment he saw or heard or thought about her. And yet somehow by the end, he overcomes this.
Right, yeah. One of the themes that comes through in this movie series is that there are no winners in war. There are no winners in the games. There are only survivors. And at the end of this series, you see that Katniss and Peeta are really just survivors. They are, just essentially PTSD'd victims of all the brutality that they've witnessed and experienced.
And the great cycle.
Shattered remnants of human beings.
The great circle of life can continue on.
Yeah, then they have some kids. Life is good, man.
Yeah, so what do you think? You got a final summary and review in you? We can start to wind this one down?
Yes, let's do that. So, The Hunger Games by not Suzanne Collins. What did Suzanne Collins write? I don't know why I associate that name with this movie.
she did. You had said someone else's name earlier.
Oh, perfect.
Yes.
I'm learning.
You're learning. You're picking it up.
So, yeah, it's definitely an interesting story. I thought it was perfectly good enough to read when I originally did. I remember reading them quite quickly. They're all told first-person perspective through Katniss's point of view, which I don't know if I'd ever read a book like that before. I mean, I'm familiar with, telling first-person perspective stories, but it somehow worked throughout the entire series. And I know for the movies, they had to add in some additional scenes that weren't from her POV, which, bettered the story for sure. You got to have some development of the villains, on their own terms in moments, talking to each other and that sort of thing. And I think those scenes work well. Ultimately, for me, this movie series lives or dies on its message. I mean, if it's just a story where you're going to have some fun and whatever, that's fine. Now, you could complain that this is basically a ripoff of Battle Royale. I don't care about that. If you got you want to take your inspiration from wherever it comes, and if you can make a thing with it, go for it. But the message I think that comes through for me is just the pointlessness of revolution and the uselessness in the belief in authority to accomplish anything productive. So for me, this is a big time recommendation. I don't know if you necessarily need to watch all 4 movies to get that, but it's a strong series. I'm not a huge Jennifer Lawrence fan. For some reason, she does okay, but I just don't think that she's that good of an actor. She's okay. Don't get me wrong. She's fine, but strong enough to carry it, but doesn't knock me over. But anyway, as a series whole, I give this a pretty good, strong recommendation. I'll give it a 7.4. Yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to me ramble on this episode. Daniel, what did you think?
All right, pretty good, pretty good. Yeah, I think that it's a pretty cohesive story, and the world building is pretty good. The interesting thing regarding the control that they had, and this is going to get Alice Jones territory for just a moment, but they had these high-speed trains connecting the different districts together, and that was a very controlled method of travel between these places. And so they were able to compartmentalize and segment, keeping them sort of locked down in a control grid. And I think that was one way to extend their power and authority over everyone. And the further away geographically, the worse they could treat those people and then extract those resources, bringing them back towards the capital. And as you were closer to the capital, they treated you a little bit better, so there was less likelihood of revolt. And so you kind of saw that in the different districts. In 13, they claimed to have obliterated, as an example against the others, to not revolt. So anyway, the movie series itself seems to tie a lot of ideas together, like gladiatorial combat, conscription, like we were talking about earlier, propaganda, media, crafting narratives, and using those things to achieve political ends. And so I think that it is it's an eye-opening experience from a perspective of what you and I share, a libertarian perspective, in that you can see how this sort of exposes the dark underbelly of how these things, these ideas and concepts are used to maintain control over a population. And so for that alone, I would recommend this film series. But beyond that, it is well done. And we didn't even get into talking about, I think the guy's name is B2 or BT, and he's Arnold from Westworld, or Bernard, the Bernarnold from that Westworld series. You've seen that, right?
I've seen one episode of the first season, but I know who you're talking about. Yeah, he's BT or TB or whatever his name is.
Yeah, the tech wizard.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's a relatively good film series, and I will be very close and give it a 6.5. So do check it out if you've got the means. I highly recommend it. And what do we want to do next as far as a movie? I know we've tossed around the idea of perhaps doing Office Space. And as we've been talking about gladiatorial-style combat, Gladiator's kind of piquing my interest right now. And in fact, my wife and I are presently watching Spartacus, the television series, and that's actually pretty good. It's pretty cheesy at the beginning. It's this Stars series that sort of mixes 300 and softcore porn. But then it starts to develop a pretty ever-increasing stakes episode to episode, where you sort of have to do the one more thing.
Sure.
And I believe that's on the Netflix. So if you get a chance, you might want to check that out. But what do you think about doing Gladiator next week?
Yeah, I could probably do Gladiator. I will be traveling, so I don't know if I'll be able to really sit down and watch a movie, but maybe I will. Maybe I will. Is that on the Netflix? Do you know?
If not, it is in the Vudu.
Okay. Well, then I got no excuses.
Yeah, no excuses. All out of excuses. All right. And I think we're about ready to wrap up the show. So speaking of all out of excuses, I wanted to let you know that coming out, or has just come out, is an interview I did with Johnny Rocket of Blast Off with Johnny Rocket and his co-host Raylene Lightheart. And that can be found at thelaunchpadmedia.com. Blast Off with Johnny Rocket. It's the Friday show, so do check that out. Also, we're going to be doing a continuing series on Wild Wild Country with the Liberty Weekly folks. And lately we've been having guest hosts fill in for Pat, who's studying for the bar exam. And so we just completed the third episode, which was with Tony Rockamora of Don't Waste Your Hate. Next week, we're going to be doing episode 4 with the guys from Peaceful Treason. And you can find all of the shows related to this series at libertyweekly.net/WWC. So that's all the time I think we have for tonight, for the Last Nighters. So thank you guys for joining us very much. You can find the show notes and more at lastnighters.com/30. And thank you and good night. And we'll continue a little bit longer on the Actual Anarchy podcast. Anything that we left out, Robert?
Probably everything, but we rambled on for quite a while. We talked about some things that were kind of inspired by, war and the idea of brutal oppression and the idea of conscription being legitimate and all that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, so about
interesting.
10% movie and 90% just ranting. So I think that
Sure.
works. That works pretty well.
It's a good ratio.
Yeah.
One day we should probably get into, I don't know if we have the time or the expertise. We definitely don't have the expertise, but we should probably maybe talk about like the Prussian school system and the indoctrination system that happened back around, I think it was Frederick the Great, where, he was having trouble, having his mercenaries, fight his armies, fight his wars and stuff. And it's hard to get somebody to die for a cause they don't believe in. So you got to indoctrinate the kids and then they'll readily throw their lives away for some bullshit. So that'd be interesting talk.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a movie that ties into that would be worth basing that discussion on, and perhaps doing a guest like Jack V. Lloyd of the Voluntarist comic. He's pretty familiar with the education system and the history on that, so he might be a good guest for it.
Ooh.
So I will broach the subject with him and see if there's a movie that ties that all together that he'd be willing to come on and talk about. And speaking of things that we've been doing and coming on to talk about, we might have interest in doing the Vietnam series, the Ken Burns series with Trey Weaver of the Subversion webcast.
Cool. Yeah, I'm all for it. It's a long series, but once you get into it, you just gotta watch another episode.
Yeah, it gives
you a lot of stuff that I had not known.
Gives you a case of the one Morse.
I think so. I mean, I'm kind of one of those military war buff guys, though. I mean, as much as I hate the state and as much as I hate all that crap, it is fascinating to see it all, how it all happened, and to really analyze it and where people go wrong and what they believe, and to see the human condition and what they're willing to die for and what they're willing to murder people for. It is fascinating as a student of humanity.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Well, perhaps after we're done with the Wild Wild Country series, we can get into that with Trey. And one other announcement I want to just mention to everyone is that we, as part of the Libertarian Union, we do a monthly talk show together with the other members. We usually have 5 or 6 different members join us, and it's the last Sunday of the month. And it's the State of the Libertarian Union talk show. So that'll be coming out right around the time that this episode comes out. So look for that. We might be running a little bit late on it, perhaps, because some of the guys weren't able to record during the day on Sunday. But look for that at libertarianunion.com. And any last parting words before we get into some Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which is available for our Patreon supporters, and you can find out how to support us at actualanarchy.com/Patreon.
Well, you guys are all awesome, and you put up with my wandering rants and our wild diversions from the movies we discuss. So thank you for putting up with us on yet another hot July episode of the Actual Anarchy podcast.
All right, yes, and I do also appreciate you guys very much, so thanks for joining us, and we will be coming back to you next week with Gladiator. Is that Ridley Scott or Tony Scott? It's one of the Scotts, I think.
Several Scotts. It's all the Scotts.
It's a bunch of Scotts. So look for that next week, and you can find the show notes and more for this episode at actualanarchy.com/87. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good night. Maximum freedom, everyone.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.